Um, Welcome to our event on the Decisive Decade, Understanding Trajectories of 14 to 24-year-olds. My name is Tara Watson. I'm the director of the Center for Economic Security and Opportunity at Brookings. And I'm really happy today to welcome two authors of our new report that we released last Friday on the Decisive Decade, as well as a distinguished group of panelists to talk about the key issues in this report. The authors of the report include Ember Smith, who is a PhD student in public policy at UC Berkeley, also a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship recipient. And Ember focuses research on safety net and inequality. She will be joined to discuss the report by Richard Reeves, who is the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, which he founded in 2023. He's also author of the 2022 book of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Richard is a non-resident senior fellow here at Brookings, and he also focuses his research on inequality and social mobility with an emphasis on gender. After we hear about the report, we will hear from several panelists. These include Lara, who is professor of social psychology at Simon Fraser University. She runs the Helping and Happiness Lab there. Her research focuses on links between generosity, happiness, and well-being. She will be joined by Ian Rowe, who is a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute. He's focused on education and upward mobility and is the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies. He has also been the CEO of public prep charter schools and has held other leadership roles, including at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, MTV, and the White House. And finally, Jonathan Zaff is a research professor in applied human development at Boston University and the director of the Institute there for Children and Youth. He focuses on positive youth development. We're really so grateful that all of these distinguished guests are willing to speak with us today. But to get started, we're going to turn it over to Ember and Richard to tell us about their research. So please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. Thank you for that kind welcome, and to everyone who's joining us. This work has been some time in the making, and it's a bit of a homecoming for Ember and I, both former colleagues of Tara's and her team. So it's a delight to be able to present this work. And so our plan is to just spend no more than the next tops 15 minutes, hopefully a little bit less, just outlining the kind of key parts of the report before switching over to the distinguished panel that I'm delighted that you've been able to assemble for this report. Ember's in the driving seat in terms of the slides, and then she's going to go through most of the descriptive data work that she's largely, I think, been responsible for. So huge thanks to her as a co-author. But I'm going to start by just saying a little bit about motivation. So if you could just kind of go on one here. So this period we've looking at in the report, 14 to 24, what we label the decisive decade, hasn't always gotten a good rap. So this is the old shepherd in Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. And you can read what it says here, but I wish there were no age between 10 and 3 and 20. So not exactly the same as ours, but close, or that youth would sleep out the rest. For there's nothing in between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancient tree, stealing and fighting. I want to make it clear that none of this language has been approved by the Brookings Institution, including the use of the word old to describe the old shepherd or anything beyond that, or indeed the claims here about family formation, criminal activity, etc. But it gives you a kind of sense of this has always been a kind of period of life between adolescence and young adulthood that's been one of turbulence and decision-making and opportunity, as well as kind of potential opportunity to go off the rails as well as stay on the rails. This is not a new idea that this is an important and potentially kind of decisive decade. But there are some more sober and academic reasons too why we think this is an important decade to focus on. So the motivation for the paper is to say that this decade, 14 to 24, does cover some of the key transitions, obviously, in education, work, and family. The median member of this group would start off in compulsory education, living with their parents and not in paid work, and those things would not be true at the end. Most of them will have left home. Most of them will be in work, and have gone through many of these major transitions. There's some evidence that ninth grade, and it was the kind of first bookend, if you like, of the decisive decade, has been shown to have some kind of predictive, I won't say causal, but predictive consequences for educational outcomes later. That's the Chicago Consortium on School Research has done some of that work. But also at the end of our decade, at age 24, there's some evidence that life chances, and I'm just going to put it here, and I should say this is my language, not Ember's or anybody else's, and not all of this is in the report, but it's sort of semi-set. In other words, it's not a determinative decade, even if it is important and decisive. And so just this sense that you can see from the work that Raj Chetty and his team did at Opportunity Insights, that 24 seems to be the period at which moving to a different place doesn't really seem to affect your outcomes, but also it's when the correlation between parents' incomes and children's incomes seems to stabilize. So it's kind of that gives you a sense of like, this is when the ground is starting to settle a little bit around when your life chances. So for that reason, we think it's important. Also, it's a period when you see big differences by class, race, and gender open up, and Ember's going to cover some of those now. And I would say, just in a nod to the name of the center that's hosting this panel, is that I think it's pretty clear. I hope you'll be convinced by the end of this presentation that understanding this decade is absolutely crucial for understanding opportunity over the life course, but also the foundations of economic security. So with that motivation, I'll let Ember take the lead now, going through some of the kind of key empirical results. These are just top line. I encourage you all to look at the report, but she's pulling out some of the kind of key results from the report. And then I'll just say a couple of words in terms of next steps and implications. Ember, over to you.
Great, thanks, Richard. So as he mentioned, I'm going to roll through a few of our key results in the presentation and highlight some of the education and work trajectories during this time period. And then we'll also take a look cross-sectionally at some of the differences by socioeconomic status, race, and gender. So first, we'll start with just a high-level look at what education and work look like between the ages of 16 to 24. So all the way to the left here, you can see that a little bit more than 90% of 16-year-olds are enrolled in school. That's those middle two bars there, with just more than 10% also working on the side. By the time young adults reach the age of 24, that number gets to just 22%. And in the meantime, unsurprisingly, young adults become more likely to engage in the workforce and less likely to be enrolled in school. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the very top portion of this bar chart here, this neither category. This shows the share of young adults who are not engaged in the workforce nor in school. This group is sometimes referred to as disconnected or disengaged or opportunity youth. These are young adults who are not even working in school part-time. So between the ages of 16 and 18, that share is pretty low, under 10%, but between the ages of 19 and 24, pretty strikingly, this figure is constant, more or less, around 15% of all young adults. So next, we'll take a look at what some of these statistics look like by different groups. This is a slightly different data set, but it allows us to look at young adults based on their parents' income or socioeconomic status. So on the x-axis here, we're looking at parents' income and a socioeconomic quintile. So on the farthest left bar chart here, we see the lowest income, approximately 21-year-olds. And what we see here is that a little bit more than a fifth of the lowest income 21-year-olds are in this disconnected category or disengaged from work or education. And that's compared to just 6% of their higher income counterparts. Higher income young adults are also more likely to be in school and more likely to be in education and school relative to their lower income counterparts. Next, we'll take a look at where students and young adults are at by the time they are 24. So this figure picks up sort of where we left off in the first figure. So we saw the education and work trajectories between the ages of 16 and 24. Now we're looking at age 24 at differences by race and gender. So I'll first draw your attention to the bottom section of this figure, the differences by race. What we see here is that the white 24-year-olds are most likely to be in the workforce and not in school. Asian or Pacific Islander 24-year-olds are the most likely to be enrolled in school, and Black or Hispanic 24-year-olds are the most likely to be disconnected, with the rates around 20% compared to 14% of white, Asian, or Pacific Islander 24-year-olds. For the differences by gender, we see that young men are a little bit more likely to be engaged in the workforce compared to school and women. And young women are a little bit more likely to be in that disconnected category. And you might expect that there could be gender differences by caregiving responsibility. And so in the next slide, we take a look at what those might look like. So on the left panel here, you can see the gender differences in work and education composition for 24-year-old men and women. And for non-parents or people who don't live with their children, there's essentially no gender difference in the work and educational composition. But for parents on the right-hand side here, you can see massive differences by gender. So the entire gender difference in the disconnection category is driven by parenthood. So more than a third of 24-year-old mothers are disengaged from education and work, compared to just a little bit more than 10% of young fathers. And mothers are also more likely to be enrolled in school during this time period as well. And we think this is a significant figure as well, because about 1/3 of the 24-year-olds who are falling into this disconnected category are parents themselves. So it has significant consequences for the young adults' trajectories and what they choose to do in terms of their work and education. On the next figure, we get some impression of the living arrangements of 24-year-olds. So here we slightly changed the definitions from what we use in the report, if you're reading that. But on the farthest right panel here, we see the 30% of 24-year-olds are living with their parents. Around 20% are living with a partner. So that includes an unmarried partner or a potential spouse. Around 20% of 24-year-olds are living with children of their own, and around a third are in other arrangements. So that could be living alone or with roommates or perhaps other family members. And again, we can see a couple of differences by gender. So 24-year-old men are 10 percentage points more likely to be living at home with their parents compared to their female counterparts. So that's more than a third of young men living at home still. And young women are much more likely to be forming their own families. That's those middle three bars there. They're more likely to be living with a partner or with children of their own compared to young men. This is just a high-level overview of some of the living arrangements during this time period. And so far, we've looked at quite a few of the different outcomes happening between the ages of 16 and 24 and some of the differences between the ages of 16 and 24. But finally, we want to take a look at some of the achievements that young adults have attained by the time they reach this age. So the top panel is showing us some of those education milestones. 31% of 24-year-olds have a bachelor's degree or higher. About a fifth are still enrolled or working on higher education. That includes grad students and people who are attending undergraduate. In the middle panel, we see that about 60% are working full-time, and a little bit more than half are financially independent, which we define as at least 150% of the federal poverty line for one person. For reference, in 2019, that number is about $20,000. And then we can see that 30% are still living with their parents, and then 20% are married, and about 20% have children. So young adults age 24 are a little bit more likely to be living with their parents still than they are to be married or to have children. So that gives us a little bit of an overview of some of the differences by socioeconomic status, gender, and race, and what's going on in this time period. With that, I'll hand it back over to Richard to discuss some of the implications, and I look forward to the panel.
Great. Thank you, Ember. Amazing job summarizing what you can tell from that presentation. Is a very data-rich report. And even that, you always feel like you're only kind of scratching the surface. So what are the implications of this? I think, first of all, the kind of interactions are very important here between, I think as a couple of Ember's charts showed, between family life and employment and education. And how we can't kind of presume that they're clustering in the same way. But here are some of the takeaways that certainly I think we and I take from the report. One is there has been a focus on the early years in recent public policy discussion, sometimes tending towards early years determinism, one might say. And I think what this tells us is that actually this is a decade that deserves at least as much focus, perhaps, as the first half decade of life in terms of importance for outcomes. It's also a very interesting period in the sense that kind of there's a lot of plasticity kind of in development. You know this from a lot of the work on adolescents, including some of the work that the national academies have done, showing that this is a kind of period of at least equal plasticity to early years, but it's also increasing choices. Like, where does that plasticity go? What do you do? So you see this kind of explosion of choices at the same time as you see this real increase in kind of development. I think some of these differences in the kind of launching into adulthood that Ember highlighted in a couple of the slides, sort of between gender differences. I'm now working a lot on these gender differences, so you'd expect me, I guess, to focus on this. So with that caveat, I do nonetheless find that difference in kind of the living at home, transitioning to family life, differences between young men and young women, important for policymakers and scholars to understand and dig into. There are these striking race gaps in post-secondary trajectories, which were highlighted too. I also think that this opportunity youth or disconnected youth, whatever the terminology is, of 18 to 24-year-olds, or those who are not in work or employment, and just seeing the nuances kind of emerging there. And I think there are all kinds of nuances you'd see if you intersect by race as well, but not least that very striking finding that we can't assume that the reasons young women are in neither work nor education to be the same as the reasons why young men are not least because of the care responsibilities that the women are much more likely to have taken on. I also think the report highlights the need to focus on some of these key transitions from home to your own home, from one education to another kind of education, from education to the workforce. And rather than thinking this period as like a conveyor belt that you just get onto at 14 and drop off again at 24, it's more like a series of stepping stones. And the ability to kind of successfully transition across these stepping stones is highly important for what kind of follows in terms of people's life chances. So thinking about key transitions, this is a decade of transition, is another way to think about it. And so how those transitions take place, who is able to make them? I sometimes think about this like there are these stepping stones, they're quite difficult, they're quite slippy, but some people have someone on each side helping them across. They're being helped across those stepping stones, and others are supposed to do it on their own. And we then sometimes wonder why it's a more difficult one. And I think the last kind of key point, this is something Ember and I talked a lot about in the report, is it's quite clear from this that there both is not and should not be like one track to success, one narrow track to success, but we should think in terms of opportunity pluralism. Given the pluralism that we see in these kind of different trajectories, it's very important that policymakers think in terms of pluralism as well, in terms of multiple pathways through this decisive decade and into and hopefully to secure start in the labor market. And so with that, I'm very happy to kind of hand on back to Tara and the panel. Look forward to the discussion. Ember is sticking around, so if there are highly detailed questions about the weighting that she used in the different data sets, we'll bring her back on the stage. But otherwise, happy to have the discussion, and thanks again.
Thanks so much. You heard a small part, actually, of the data that is actually in the report. So I encourage the audience to go onto the Brookings website and get more information if you're interested in digging in more on some of these transitions that are detailed in the report. And I also wanted to acknowledge the support of the NEKIC Foundation for making this research possible. But before we get into more details, we are going to turn it over to our panelists and just hear some initial reactions about the report and their thoughts about this decade in general and what create success and opportunities for success in this 14 to 24-year-old age range. So I'm going to start with Lara. And Lara, we'd love to hear your thoughts. I know that you've been working on happiness and well-being, and I'd love you to think about how those issues connect with the issues that Ember and Richard just talked about.
Sure. So thank you so much for the summary, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It might be helpful to begin just with a quick introduction to myself and this year's World Happiness Report to kind of ground my comments and reflections. And so, as mentioned in the introduction, I'm a co-editor of the World Happiness Report, which is an annual report examining well-being and some predictors of well-being amongst people around the world. We do so often in the report by examining responses to the Gallup World Poll, which is a large international and representative sample of individuals aged 15 and over in upwards of 130 countries. And so importantly, each person is asked as they complete the Gallup World Poll a series of questions, including one on their life satisfaction using the Cantrell ladder, which asks people to simply imagine this 11-rung ladder ranging from 0 being their worst possible life at the bottom to 10 being their best possible life at the top, and to situate themselves kind of on this imaginary ladder. And then from people's responses, we can compute these averages across nations and rank countries globally to see where they stand. We can also use various factors to predict what explains these variations in global rankings. And this year, for one of the first times in over a decade, we looked at life satisfaction across the lifespan. There's a very rich data set there, but I think most relevant to today's conversation is that global data tends to show that young adults, that is people under the age of 30, tend to report some of the highest levels of life satisfaction. And then life satisfaction tends to dip in one's 40s and 50s and then hit an upswing in the 60s and beyond. However, one of the key findings of this year's World Happiness Report, I think, that received a lot of attention was that young adults in North America in particular were reporting some of the lowest levels of life satisfaction we've seen in this area over the last bit of time. So while, for instance, the United States ranks 23rd overall when we look across nations this year, if we're to zero in on just those under the age of 30, they were ranking 62nd. And so as we head into today's conversation, I think that's a pretty fascinating place to begin, because we're seeing some wide differences in life satisfaction across the lifespan, and some of the lowest levels we've seen in North America for quite some time. And well-being, as we can get into very richly later, is strongly predictive of people's emotional and various forms of other success over the lifespan.
Great, thank you.
My pleasure.
I'm going to ask you more about that, but first I want to hear from our other panelists. Ian, can we turn to you? You have a long career understanding educational systems, which of course are a key part of the transitions that we've been hearing about. So could you talk a little bit more about your perspectives on this critical decade?
Yeah, thank you, Tara, and thank you to the entire team for inviting me on. I'm speaking both as a senior fellow at AEI, but also, as mentioned, I've run public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan for the last 15 years, elementary and middle schools, and most recently now running high schools, Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtues-based international baccalaureate high school. So we're starting the decisive decade for our 14-year-olds. So I very much agree with which seems to be one of the key findings, that there is no single path to success. There's not a predetermined, prescriptive path that everyone must ascribe to. However, I think what the research shows, and certainly research I've done, is that there are clearly better pathways than others that give young people a far greater likelihood of success in terms of avoiding poverty, achieving economic mobility, forming strong families. And, it actually, you mentioned the Raj Chetty work. Chetty did a study about a decade ago, Where's the Land of Opportunity, where he looked at 40 million tax records of children and their parents to figure out if a child was born in the lowest quintile of economic status 30 years later, what was the likelihood that they would actually be in the top quintile? And I always find the research that he did interesting because it maps to my findings of the factors that I've seen drive upward mobility amongst young people, particularly kids in tough situations, where the Chetty research basically said America is a collection of societies, some of which are lands of opportunity with high rates of mobility across generations, but others that experience persistent inequality, places in which few children escape poverty. So the key question is, what makes the difference? What are the factors that really drive this idea of a decisive decade? And there were three main ones that Chetty certainly highlighted. First, the strongest predictors of upward mobility are measures of family structure, such as the fraction of single parents in the area. So that's something we should talk about. Second, I find interesting, high upward mobility areas tend to have higher fractions of religious individuals and greater participation in local civic organizations. So I was a little surprised to see that the research didn't really identify faith and religion at all, but I think it is a tool, certainly in my experience, where young people who have adopted a religion or a personal faith commitment have had higher trajectories of upward mobility. And then the third factor identified in Chetty's research, proxies for the quality of the K-12 school system are also correlated with mobility. And that's something clearly I see. The high school that we just launched here in the Bronx only 7% of kids that start ninth grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college. And yet in this district, there's a cap on charter schools. So it's very limited school choice. So I would reaffirm this idea that there are multiple pathways, but the things that seem to make a huge difference in terms of increasing likelihood of patterns of family formation, we can talk a little bit more about that, certainly the success sequence, the adoption of religious organizations, personal faith commitments, and then access to high quality school choice. Those certainly would be factors that I'd also want to supplement to the report.
Thanks for that. Great. And we will now turn to Jonathan, who is an expert in development of youth, and also I think has studied social capital quite a bit and might be able to speak to how social capital fits into this narrative as well.
Sure. Thanks, Tara. And thanks everyone, and Richard and Ember, and thank you for the great presentation. I mean, it was really fun to read the report and to really gain just the, I think, rich insights that you bring out for everybody. For me, I'll start with just two sort of main points that sort of come from my work. So for a number of years, I worked for America's Promise Alliance in DC, and we worked sort of really as an intermediary among cross-sector collaboration to really focus on a lot of these issues. So really focus on high school graduation, college readiness, and real thriving among all young people. So this is something I've had the privilege of being able to engage with for a long time. And specifically have focused on this group of opportunity youth that Ember and Richard spoke about. So really in the work that we've done, and we've done studies, team and I, that have been national level, that have focused on individual states, and then also hyper local. And so across all that work, two big things come back to us time and again. One, which is incredibly hard to to solve, so easy to diagnose, harder to solve, and the other, I think, provides opportunity for intervention. So the first is around adversities that too many young people are facing. So all young people, regardless of income, regardless of race and ethnic background, will experience adversity in life. What those adversities are will vary greatly, and the number that they experience will also vary greatly. What we see is around 3 adversities. So if you look at the literature on ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, 3-ish tends to be where things start to go not great for young people. In research that we've done nationally with young people who've left high school without graduating, we find it to be around an average of 6 adversities that young people are facing, and compared to those who remain in school without interruption, to be more around 2 or so. So, you can see this sort of almost inequity and adversity experience, and then we can see the implications of that experience. And again, when we break that down, we've looked at that through a variety of data sets and looked at that through based on income level. And again, we see income distributed in the same way with adversity, where those from lower income upbringings and communities are just in places where they're going to experience more adversities, whether that's community violence, whether that's issues in the home, or issues in their schools, et cetera. So that's hard. That's hard to fix, right? These are systemic issues, and we can have, I'm sure, a very long discussion about what is implicated in those issues and why they exist, and all very important discussion to have. However, regardless of the root cause, what we also know is incredibly hard to fix for today's generation of young people. So what do we do now? And that really leads to that other piece, which is a little more malleable, which is around the essentiality of relationships in young people's lives. So time and again, we see that what crosses programmatic boundaries, what crosses school boundaries, are people. And so we see that young people, when they have the right support systems in place, the people who can both love them and care about them, the great Jürgen Bronfenbrenner, great developmental psychologist, basically, I won't do his words justice, but basically paraphrased as, if you can just find one young person to love that young person will thrive. And so what can we do so that all young people feel loved as a base? The next step, though, is not just to stop there at this idea of caring, but it's the idea that there's also a variety of other supports that young people need, whether it's helping them navigate the barriers and opportunities that they may face, especially during this time period, whether it's providing things like lunch money or bus fare to either, to get to the job they might need to get to, whether it's just really encouraging them to reach their goals and applaud them when they reach them. all these are essential supports that young people need, and they need a variety of adults around them who can help them achieve it. However, we also find an inequity about how these relationships are distributed across communities. And so in one study we did find actually at a community level that just the availability of adults in a community in comparison to the number of young people in a community vary greatly. So just the ability to find that adult in your life is oftentimes constrained. So again, just to, again, excited about this conversation and happy to, have a conversation also about what are some examples of programs and initiatives that have been implemented to help encourage the idea of relationships. But again, sort of too many adversities, too few relationships seems to be a story that we see.
Great, thank you so much. I found this all fascinating and I have a lot of questions, but before I jump in, I wanted to give you, Richard, the opportunity to respond to anything that jumped out at you from what these three panelists said.
Yeah, so I'll make one really boring point and hopefully one slightly less boring point. I mean, the boring point is that the data constraints mean that some of these questions can't be answered within the same data set, which is one of the reasons I think it's so great to have Lara here talking about the mental health aspect, which are not in there, and certainly some things that Ian mentioned. And there is, I think, growing pressure to try and just find ways to link some of the different data sets, particularly for this group, which would allow us to answer some of those questions. That's the boring point. The slightly less boring point, I hope, is it builds on some of the things that have been said. In fact, all three of the panelists, and thank you all for your thoughtful comments and taking the time to read the report, is this difference between what you might think of as the kind of relational approach to this decade and helping people through this decade, and a resource approach, which would focus more on kind of bricks and mortar, dollars spent, etc. And I think what you're all pointing to in a different way is to see relationships as a resource itself, but also to think about the ways in which the different structures and systems and institutions can be more relational, right? So if you think about a high school, I was just struck by a recent paper showing the importance of mentors in high school. And these are not official mentors, they're just teachers that the high schoolers looked up to. It turned out that actually the men were slightly more overrepresented. That's part of the reason I kind of saw it, but that's not my main point here. The main point is here that just within a school, having the adult that takes the extra time, that can love you, etc. Do teachers feel they have the time and space to do that, that they're supported to do that? Are there other institutions? Ian's mentioned faith institutions, other community institutions, etc. So in other words, I think this idea that you've either got to choose between structures and relationships is false, because structures can themselves encourage and facilitate relationships or not. So maybe that's me just trying to have my cake and eat it, but I'm more interested in the way that our existing institutions can promote relationships rather than thinking that we don't need those institutions, or that there's a false choice between the two. But that's just an initial reaction, but I love the comments.
I mean, just to that point, Richard, we're at our high school, we're going to be changing our schedule. So the morning will be an advisory of 15 to 20 minutes where a teacher has the 10 kids that they are really connected to. And then there'll be a moment during the school day where that same teacher connects back with those 10 kids. And then at the end of the day, you round it out. So you get this sort of pastoral connection 3 different times during the day, which goes beyond academics and everything else, but it's really trying to establish this connection of what are the priorities for the day, what went wrong, what went right, what's going on in your life. So there are ways schools can formalize those kinds of human connections.
Thank you. That's really interesting and in line with the first question I was going to ask, which was about these institutions and where should we be thinking in terms of strengthening institutions? Schools seem like an obvious part of the puzzle, but Ian, you mentioned religious institutions, there are family institutions, there might be training programs, especially as we think about a variety of pathways to productive, happy lives. Where should we be looking in terms of the institutional structure? And I'll ask anyone who wants to jump in there.
I'm happy to. We've done a good amount of work of looking deeply into different organizations and what they're doing around these issues. And so I think, Ian, I'm excited actually to follow up with you on what your schools are doing. We've been working with Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, on an initiative, Relationship-Centered Schools, to look across the country and to see what schools are doing to forefront relationships as a strategy, as an inherent strategy in what they do, not as a separate thing that you do. So it's part of what you do. we see a lot of organizations across the country. I think about in my home state of Massachusetts, places like UTech, Roca, on the other side of the country, Homeboy Industries, places like Cap and Momentum, Perscolis, which are focused on youth who have unfortunately disconnected from these more traditional, maybe arguably productive pathways around education and workforce, but are using a multi-method approach, whether it's with apprenticeships, but it's really about connecting with adults who help guide them along different pathways, who really encourage them to persevere, to exhibit sort of workforce ready behaviors and skills that position them well for the next stage in life. And so I think there's a variety of really wonderful programs to look to as examples. And I think a question becomes, what's the scalability of those programs to really reach the number of young people who need to be reached?
Thanks. And it strikes me that this relational component is obviously a big part of how people feel about themselves in the world. So is there data in the happiness survey about connections with others, and what might that tell us?
Yes, yeah, I was going to try to chime in after this, so thank you for the prompt, Tara. I wanted to make 2 points. First, which is the World Happiness Report data, and I think one of the most robust findings from across the social sciences, I would say, over the past 20, 30 years, is that social relationships are one of the key predictors of well-being. In fact, in the World Happiness Report and data from the Gallup World Poll kind of have shown repeatedly over the past several years that having at least one person to count on in times of stress is one of the top predictors of life satisfaction around the globe. And so just wanted to reinforce what the other panelists are saying, I think, about the value there. But I also wanted to chime in with a separate point, which is not stemming necessarily from the World Happiness Report, but in response to these suggestions about scaffolding through schools and through other networks, which is that I really love the idea of kind of building this infrastructure, because one finding that has really caught my eye from social psychology over the past couple of years is that people don't always lean into social relationships, even though it would serve them well. People avoid talking to strangers, even though it makes them happy. People gain so much intimacy and warmth and happiness from having deep conversations with others, but we shy away from doing that. And so, in my classroom, I've been thinking about how to, with low stakes study groups, try to bring students in contact with their peers more often and kind of make this an opt out as opposed to opt in scenario. And so I love what Ian was saying about having this kind of scaffolded network and contact points throughout the day. I think having that as kind of the default is a really wise move.
Mm. Can I just add one point on this as well, where it's obviously a very rich discussion already, but I think that this idea of relationships, which we're talking about a lot right now, I think if you drive that through some of the discussions that Ian and I have had many arguments and discussions about family structure and kind of marriage and so on, but I think the structuring of relationships that you get through something like marriage, that's part of the point, right? I mean, marriage without a relationship wouldn't be a marriage. So it's in the same with kind of family relationships and other kinds of relationships. And so you must start with relationships and then see what's facilitating that. And I think that does bring in a lot of social conservative insights about things like marriage. But it also brings in, I think, some things that are perhaps more associated with kind of center left, which is kind of funding for extracurricular activities, mentoring, etc. But on your original question, Tara, about institutions and how they can support these kinds of relationships, I also think there's something about, I haven't really thought this through, but like sometimes we kind of separate our institutions too much. There's the whole idea of like separation of church and state, and I'm not here to argue against that, by the way, just to be clear. But almost like it's a separation of church and state, school, employer, school and community group, etc. And I always think kind of part of this is just mashing these together and blurring the lines between these institutions, because the life for the young people, as the work we've done shows, doesn't split that way. Right? We don't divide ourselves up into the kid in school, the kid in scouts, the kid in church, the kid at home, the kid on the streets, right? We're the same young person, right? And so that's why I think these apprenticeship programs and kind of high school things kind of work. I don't think it's just because of what they're adding in terms of human capital. I think it's because they break down some of these barriers between the separating lines that we too often put. So it's not just what kinds of institutions, but how do those institutions interact with each other, rather than seeing each other as separate spheres that the young people are supposed to then step across.
Yeah. I mean, Chetty often writes about the importance of cross-class connections to upward mobility. And where does that happen? Well, it typically happens in church or a faith-based institution, or it'll happen in a local community-based organization. But yeah, we often, I very much agree with you, Richard, we segment kids' lives when that's not the way it really works. Just another point about social relationships, something that we found, again, running high schools. We haven't talked about cell phones and the advent of social media and what that's doing to kids' inability to develop strong relationships. When we opened our school, we basically allowed cell phones to permeate. Not a good thing if anyone's running a school. I would strongly advise you to listen to Jonathan Haidt. And so we've restricted the use of cell phones, smartwatches, AirPods during the school day. And it is a transformed environment. Our kids they're so excited because it's almost like they have a digital oasis. They're now forced to have far more human connection with their peers and the adults. So I think when we talk about social relationships, we also should acknowledge just what has transformed, has changed, particularly with cell phones and social media, that it's actually impeding the ability of a lot of young people to foster the kinds of connections that are so crucial to building connections to, ultimate upward mobility.
That leads me into a broader question I have about social change. We've just been emerging from the COVID crisis. We've had this major technological shift. When I think back to my childhood, I think it would have been incredibly difficult to navigate all of these things. So how is the modern moment making all of these things maybe more challenging, or are there opportunities that we can see from the many changes that are happening? And Jonathan, maybe I'll start with you if you have ideas about that.
Sure. That's a tough one, but I'll try it. I mean, I appreciate your points there, because I think there's an idea of what you can be amongst a lot of people, but still be lonely. And I think with social media, we can see that happen a lot. And so what are the ways that we can, again, sort of get people to connect again in authentic ways, and then help navigate this crazy world that everybody is living in? I think one part of this is that every world is crazy. So every moment in history has been crazy in its own way, and we have to navigate those worlds. We have our own level of craziness now. And so that's sort of just one, I think, reality check that I always try to check myself on. But the other piece here, I think, does go back to where do we set up these sort of relational structures to, I should have qualified this by saying I study relationships a lot. So sometimes that's my hammer for every nail. But when we think about how do young people make decisions, we want to make sure that young people feel empowered to exact the agency that we know they have, and the wisdom that they actually have generated over the course of their much shorter lives. But at the same time, realize that they're not experts at this point on the world. They're not experts even over their own lives. And so how do we ensure that there's a scaffolding that's occurring at that time? So part of that's going to come from family. But families can be constrained often by just their own lived experiences. And so if they don't have, for instance, experience applying to college or experience filling out a FAFSA, there needs to be scaffolding there for as a family unit. If we think about it, I think, Richard, it goes back to comments you made around things like apprenticeships or different programs like big picture learning schools as a great example, where it's really an apprenticeship model of doing high school, where they will really place people, and that helps scaffold that and really help introduce young people to new opportunities and experiences with adults who become trusted navigators in their lives. And so for me, it's how do we position different, typically adults, but oftentimes peers around young people so that they can help them with those decisions.
It strikes me from this conversation that we focus our attention on what we can measure, and it's often hard to measure these relational concepts. And so from what you all are describing, we may be missing the boat if we're trying to measure, reading scores in third grade to the exclusion of, do you have a close connection with an adult in your school or something like that? Right.
It's complementary. We still need kids to read.
Of course.
Right. I mean, but there's this whole discussion of learning loss right now.
Yep.
But there's relational loss, which if we could measure 100%. It would be at least as great, right?
100%. And just one on this point about, and we've said apprenticeships and multiple pathways a few times. It really is. I think the next major movement in education reform, particularly around secondary education, which is to break this idea that college is the only immediate option after finishing high school. So in our school, at the end of sophomore year, our students can choose an international baccalaureate diploma pathway, which is more traditional college or university pathway, which is quite rigorous, or they can choose an equally rigorous careers pathway. But in those last 2 years, they can do an apprenticeship or an internship that will lead to an industry credential, which could then lead to, with labor market value, so it could lead to work. So imagine getting licensed as a phlebotomist in your junior and senior year, and then being able to work in a hospital or in computer science, or so many areas where a college degree where a college degree is not necessary to be productive. And there's a lot of data that says, particularly for young men, Richard, that if they do earn a credential out of high school, work for a few years, and do end up going back to college, much higher college completion rates, much lower rates of forming, single parent families, much lower interaction with the criminal justice system. So I think that's another thing we should think about, which is breaking this idea that college is the only play, and apprenticeships in secondary as a choice and equal stature, because we don't want to stepchild apprenticeships within high school. But I think that's another big opportunity within education reform.
And Lara, if I could bring you in here to talk a bit about happiness and mental health and how they set kids up for success in whichever of these trajectories that they're most interested in pursuing.
Certainly, yeah. So there's, I think this kind of requires a little bit, or at least for me, when first reading the evidence, it kind of required a little bit of a mental shift, because I think we often consider happiness and well-being and mental health as an outcome of a lot of successful life choices and achievements, which I think is true. But I also think there's a large and growing and pretty overwhelming body of evidence that also suggests the reverse, such that happiness and well-being and greater mental health is predictive of a whole bunch of positive outcomes. And this isn't just, graduating from high school, which is, of course, a meaningful milestone, but it's also satisfaction with your relationships. It's financial earnings later on. It's community engagement, being involved in civic opportunities. And so I think this is a pretty meaningful outcome. And there are a number of studies out there showing that individuals who are happier earlier in their teen years are earning more later on in life. They're in more stable relationships, whether that be marriage or other partnered arrangements. And they're more likely to be involved voters and contributing to society through various forms of volunteer work and donations. And so I think well-being isn't just this positive outcome we can imagine that is, going to follow later on. But I think it's worthwhile paying attention to early on in life and kind of looking at to what extent this is a mediating force on these pathways.
Richard, you mentioned in your remarks that sometimes a focus is on very young children. So there's a lot of discussion about 0 to 3 as being a critical time period. How would you convince your readers that we really should be focusing in addition on these later years, and that there's still room for investment and for developing these institutions in productive ways by the time people reach 14?
Yeah, well, I'd start with what I flicked that with my kind of brief mention of plasticity. I think the growing evidence around, particularly in adolescence, that how that's like over you see Larry Steinberg's work, but also the National Academies panel on adolescence has really, I think, it's convinced me at least anyway that we've missed just how much more brain development as well as relational and personal development goes on in those kind of later years. And so, as I mentioned, I do think it got quite close at one point to this sense of like, well, it's over by 5, right? I called it early years determinism, right? And I'm exaggerating, of course, a little bit, but you do get that sense sometimes feeling, and sometimes it moves up. I've seen people now say, no, it's 3rd grade, oh, it's 9th grade, but there's this kind of sense that, well, it's too late. And the thing I think I would really push against, based on some of this evidence, but also the work of the other panelists here, is like that's just a horribly fatalistic view that's not supported by the evidence that it's ever too late.
Correct.
Right. And in particular, these differences in outcome that you see by all kinds of things, as well as these all the other things we talked about, just kind of tell us, I think, that like the sense that a 16-year-old or 22-year-old is somehow beyond rescue is it's just wrong. It's not just wrong morally. I think it's kind of increasingly clear that it's wrong empirically. And then I think the other thing I would add is, like, no matter what you're interested in, whether it's sort of, secure family formation or gaps in race equity or whatever, some of these differences are so glaring in these critical years that you can't be serious about either of those things. You can't be serious about, secure family formation and marriage if that's, a concern of yours, if you're not worried about what's happened by 24. But also, if you're interested in race equity, look at those differences that Ember highlighted in opportunity youth and disconnected youth, which John has done so much work on by race, right? So I think that if anything comes out of this, it is just this sense of like any neglect of this. It's not to say early years doesn't matter, but I would say right now, if I had to choose between investing in these years and the early years, I'd invest in these years.
Do other panelists have thoughts about this particular decade and why it's important?
Well, I would just say I think it's actually silly to put these two ideas in competition with one another. There's clearly significant brain development occurring in early childhood, prenatal through age 5. It's undoubtedly true. It is also true that there is this adolescent learning support. There are different types of neural connections being made, and in particular around decision-making and risk-taking that occurs during this particular period. That's why we call it the decisive decade. And even still, you're not completely determined by what happens age 14 to 24, but it does have a huge impact on your life. It's one of the reasons, and Richard, I couldn't let a session go by without mentioning the success sequence, but it is why we teach this content in our classes, and it's very important. We teach it in what's called a descriptive fashion, not a prescriptive fashion. And by this data, I mean that young people, millennials who finish at least their high school degree, then get a full-time job. And if they have children, if they got married first, 97% of millennials who follow that series of decisions avoided poverty. I mean, this is success sequence data, which was originated in Brookings many years ago. I think Belle Sawhill might actually even be watching us. So we teach that content as part of an overall class called Pathways to Power, which is ultimately about decision making. It's about goal setting in your life. What are the likely barriers? What is it that you're seeking to accomplish? And we want you to know all the different pathways and likelihood of rewards or consequences associated with different series of decisions. And this period of time, there's no question, there's a relationship with brain development and helping young people make better decisions by understanding what the likely successes or failures are associated with different decisions.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I would just add in, just getting back, because even Richard just brilliantly, I think, stated, I think what needs to be said around this idea that's a continuum. Development's development. It doesn't start or end. It does. Well, we do know it starts at the beginning, but it continues, and you can. We had actually several years ago commissioned work when I was at America's Promise from Jim Heckman, Flavio Cunha, to basically simulate what the differences in investments if you did it early or late or continuous. And as I recall, looking at the lowest quintile economically, we find that if you invest in early childhood, you basically go from, I think it's a 42% graduation rate to a 65% high school graduation rate. But if you have a continuous investment, you basically go to 90%. And so one is it shows these investments compound. So if you just invest once and then just hold back, yes, do you get return on that investment? Absolutely. Does it maximize your investment? Absolutely not. The other side of that is that it clearly shows, Richard, I appreciate you saying this, is that the science is clearly on our side here. If a young person has disconnected in the ways that you and Ember show in your report, nothing is hopeless. There are plenty of interventions, there are plenty of policy initiatives that have been shown time and time again to be effective in helping young people get on a more, what would be called, productive pathway.
I have to add at this point that I was at an event where Jim Heckman, who just referred to, for those, probably most people listening to this will know who Jim Heckman is, but he won his Nobel Prize for the work on early years. And at this event, he said, why is everyone only obsessed with the early years? We should be spending more time on adolescents. And I said, whose fault is that? I mean, like, he's the father of the early years movement, but you're quite right that his more recent work has actually been stressing the importance of adolescence and continuous scaffolding. So
we had a number of people write in with questions, and several of them were oriented around the role of neighborhoods. So I'm hoping the panelists could talk a little bit about why neighborhoods are important. And you referred to the Opportunity Insights work, which plays, suggests an important role for neighborhoods beyond just, for example, family structure in an individual household. It's really a family structure of the neighborhood that seems to be driving these long-run outcomes. What are neighborhoods doing that are promoting the pieces of the puzzle that we've been talking about? And that's it for anyone who wants to jump in. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is sometimes a tough area for policymakers, because I think you start to run into the limitations of what policy can do. There's been lots of efforts to try and legislate stronger families, more marriage, or trying to get more people to go to church. But you can both recognize that there are limitations on policy while still acknowledging that we need faith-based institutions. We need young people to understand the likelihood of better lives for themselves or their children if they have children within marriage. And we don't have to make moral judgments, but the data is pretty overwhelming. So in neighborhoods, again, the Chetty research says it pretty clearly. Strong families matter. And by the way, his data even suggests that even if a child is in a single parent home, if within the neighborhood there are a lot of strong married fathers, you get the neighborhood effect of even kids who even in their own home may not have a dad in the home, still benefits from the sort of the neighborhood effect. So strong families, strong school choice, strong faith-based organizations, those typically seem like the kinds of things that are happening in neighborhoods that lead to greater economic mobility for all kids in that area, regardless of their own immediate circumstance.
So Jonathan, maybe I can broaden those concepts to think about social capital in general.
Yeah, one is people should read Raj Chetty's work. It's him and his colleagues. It's brilliant. It really is. As I mentioned, at the beginning, my colleague Tom Malone and I had done an analysis just a few years ago, looking at sort of the change in these youth-adult ratios on a census tract level over time, and how those related to things like high school dropout rates. And we see huge effects, especially when you cross that with things like the at a community level, the educational attainment of those in that community. And so what that tells us is that, I think very much with what you're saying, Ian, is that if you have adults in your community who have experienced things, let's say like going to college, which means doing certain things in high school, being able, knowing how to apply to college, knowing how to do school, that can be very helpful, not just as a role model, but as actually navigators that you have access to. And so what are ways but again, those are unequally distributed, those youth adult ratios across the country. And so what are ways we can think about the capacities of communities? My colleague Renee Spencer, who does a lot of research on mentoring, has talked about stocking the pond. And really, how do you ensure that the pond of a neighborhood has sort of the sufficient adults in that community who can help a young person navigate life, but also support them in ways they need to be supported.
Thanks.
Can I just add one thing on it? So Lara, you go first.
I was just going to say, from a well-being perspective, I think communities and neighborhoods go a very far way. They provide some of the most proximal sources of support and relationships for well-being through, of course, schools, but of course, just through neighborhood friendships, through community sports. All of these are really meaningful channels for finding broader social networks, meaningful connections. And one thing to also mention is, I mean, I think a lot of this might be peer-based and mentor-based, but some of my colleagues and I have recently been exploring kind of these intergenerational friendships that might come from some kinds of school scaffolding or community type infrastructure. And I think that's really one untapped resource. I think that it provides benefits in both directions. And some of our early work kind of suggests that it might even just have benefits for those in its orbit who are not even directly participating in the program itself as an older member or as a youth, but also just for the parents and for the community. It seems to have these ripple benefits. And so from a well-being perspective, I think communities offer some of the closest kind of groundwork for a lot of these predictors of well-being.
Yeah, and it speaks a bit to your earlier point, Lara, about the wariness that some people might have as well. It's that almost need, or increasingly kind of need permission or a structure. Like my mum, for example, volunteers in a school to read, right? And you can understand that there's obviously growing concern about like child protection and so on around like who's in schools and but there's also a counter danger, which is that we kind of send a message that like, you know, schools are fortresses and you know, the community shouldn't go there. And I think the answer to your questions that like neighborhoods have people in them, as everyone's kind of pointed out there, you need people in them. And I was going to mention the father present stuff that Ian mentioned too, and actually it was super interesting that it was kind of dads being around, independent of your own dad being around, mattered in ways that were impossible to get at from the data. But it's interesting that putting people near each other doesn't necessarily mean they interact with each other. And so thinking about the design of neighborhoods, I think this is another example of how institutions and structures and public policies are not the opposite of relationships. They can facilitate relationships. And I'm going to refer to some AI work that Ryan Streeter was on, and I can't remember who the co-authors were. And maybe if you were, Ian, I apologize, but looking at the amenities in different neighborhoods by social class, you know, parks, libraries, sidewalks. What are those? Those are places where you meet and talk to people, right? And so I think that actually thinking about the urban environment or whatever the environment is matters too. And they did show massive class gradients in the availability of what I would call kind of relationship enhancing public infrastructure, right? So I think you can think about it in that sense too.
Yeah, thanks. I was hoping, Richard, you might be able to talk about what you learned from doing this work on 14 to 24-year-olds that maybe puzzled you, surprised you, that you didn't expect going in.
Yeah, so I probably should have known how big the race gaps were in opportunity youth, but the different, 20%, 1 in 5. Numbers that we saw at the end of the Decisive Decade for Black and Hispanic young adults jumped out as the fact that you don't see Ember underlined this in her presentation, but that actually the kind of rates of disconnection, I'll use that shorthand for now, like a 21 are similar to 24. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily the same people, but nonetheless, it does look like a lot is happening at like 2021. And I think stuff was happening a little bit earlier on that front, perhaps, and then maybe getting a bit more stuck. And then the difference in the experience of young parents, if they're depending on whether they're mums or dads, which again was in there. Like I didn't expect such a dramatic difference. I thought it'd be a difference, but I do think it means that like the definition of people like is out of work, out of education, but there's another thing you could be doing too, which is caring, right? And so the other thing you're kind of doing is caring, and a 1 in 5 are, and this is back to, I think this is where Ian's point about don't separate the early years from the later years, because some of the people in our Decisive Decade are parents, and so they've got kids in those early years, right? So that's the way the cycle turns. And so I wasn't surprised by the direction, but I was surprised by the extent of the difference between the experience of young mums and young dads. So those are probably some of the things that jumped out to me.
And do any of the other panelists have things they want to point out from the report that were surprising to them, or more generally things they've learned from working, studying this group of young adults and their trajectories?
I think this is not directly from the report. I would just say this idea of the decisive decade, where particularly this whole idea of decision making, where young people have the ability to exercise their own agency. If you look at data from 1990 and even before till present day, you see this dramatic reduction in teen pregnancy rates, right? So clearly, young people got the message, and that has been one of probably the greatest public health achievements of our time. And yet, if you look at that same period from 1990 to present day, so teen pregnancy, age 15 to 19, dramatic difference, but non-marital birth rates for young people, for women aged 20 to 24, dramatic increases to about 70%, 90% amongst Black kids, young Black women, 24 and under, and about 60% to young white women, 24 and under. So dramatically high numbers, but it does suggest we can influence these decisions, right? If young people, you can see that dramatic difference among teens, and then clearly different decisions being made. To me, it just says there's possibility. We have hope. And I think if we empower these institutions, if we empower more young people to understand the agency that they do have within their own lives, they're quite capable of making strong decisions within this period that can have lifelong benefit.
Yeah, it could be the deciding decade. That's implied in decisive, but yeah, it's both. Yeah. In fact,
yeah. I like that as an addendum, Richard, because deciding puts the young person more in power.
Right. It's not happening to them. They're doing it as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's a good corrective. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad the way you frame that in, Richard. I like that sort of new twist. Because I think what we know from science, we also know from, I think, just those of us who've had teenagers, they have lots of agency. And so an agency actually is a strength. And so that's a strength that's inherent in all of us as humans. We all have agency. And so we are always making decisions. And often as adults, we can think that a decision being made by a young person is not the right decision. We did some deep qualitative work with young people to look at some of those strengths among youth who had disconnected. And you have young people who were deciding to leave high school because they needed in their minds, and I wouldn't disagree with this, to care for a sick grandmother, to take care of their siblings. They had to not be really, they had to be not quite above the table in the kinds of work that they were able to then do in order to bring money in. But if you think about the strength that these young people are showing, they're exacting a whole lot of agency and making actually very reasonable, compassionate decisions to support their families. They're not decisions we would hope they would need to make. We would hope that they would be able to make different decisions. And I think that's a different question to try to answer than to think that these are young people always making negative decisions or making bad decisions. And again, I think to your point also, Ian, around sort of this activation of young people to affect change. I was just looking at some recent data from CIRCLE, so the Center for Information Research on Learning, Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts. North of 70% of young people in this age range would be considered likely voters. That's a lot. And they care about stuff. They care about having top issues around having a living wage, about having financial self-sufficiency. Those are their top issues across the board. And so what are we, the collective we, doing to kind of support that agency that young people are enacting?
Yeah, Lara, both of your co-panelists have suggested some hopes, some reasons for optimism. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about where we should be happy about the way things are going, or spots of optimism for the future.
Yeah, certainly. A couple points of, I noted a couple points of overlap when reading this report and the World Happiness Report. But also I think one is the optimism that I think was just nicely noted by Jonathan here is this caring dimension. So when many people are opting out of or are not engaged in work and not engaged in education, they might be caring for others. I just wanted to note that in one of my favorite findings over the last few years of the World Happiness Report has been this increase in benevolence that we've seen, not just in North America, but around the world on kind of these three key indicators measured by Gallup, which is helping a stranger, engaging in donations, and engaging in volunteer work. And donations are not that are equivalent or maybe slightly lower amongst the lowest cohort, youngest cohort, if you will. But helping a stranger is one that young adults are reporting above head and shoulders above others. And so I think it might not just be in these caretaking roles for children and for older relatives or for ones for others in one's most immediate surrounding, but it might even be towards strangers as well. And I think that's a really bright spot yeah, it's not just North American data, but it's global data. The other thing I just wanted to mention that was raised by the other co-panelists is the importance of this autonomy and choice. Feeling as if you have an opportunity to engage and direct your life decisions is a key predictor of life satisfaction in the World Happiness Report data, but in many other data sets as well. And I think focusing our efforts on providing those opportunities and information that might come from these choices is a really wise move. When we noticed in this year's World Happiness Report that young adults in North America were reporting some of the lowest levels of life satisfaction we had a feeling this might garner some interest and did some further digging into what might be distinguishing this younger cohort now to their predecessors. And one of the most striking findings was that, well, a couple, but one was that these individuals felt lower levels of support than some earlier generations, which is something we talked about earlier, but also these individuals were feeling less freedom to make their life choices, perhaps because of life constraints in other domains and other respects. And so I think that was one of the key predictors distinguishing current youth from those 10, 20 years ago. And so I think providing the flexibility we can, whether that be through friends and family, whether that be through our school systems, or whether that be through policy, I think are some wise moves and some opportunities and points for optimism.
Great. So Richard, I'm going to give you the final word for 1 minute on where you see bright spots.
Yeah, so I see similar bright spots, particularly around the agency and autonomy piece. And I was pleased to see that some of the quotes disconnected youth in some ways are kind of caring, etc. But more in, I think, the development of the field and the tone of this conversation, because I think this is a general problem, I think, for social scientists, is that we make our living from pointing out, nasty looking data points, right? And that doesn't mean they're not true. It doesn't mean you can pay attention to them. But the reason I really like the spirit of this response to the conversation is that pessimism about young people in particular is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I do worry that the current framing of some of this debate, and I worry about potentially my own contribution to it. And I think I just heard Lara saying something similar, is that if young people do kind of hear from, research studies and from academics and from podcasts and from the media, it's just what terrible shape they're in, then perhaps you shouldn't be so surprised if they end up internalizing that view. And so bringing a note of optimism to this conversation, I think, is actually not only kind of morally important, but I think could be empirically important too, in the sense that, like, these young people will become the kind of people that we kind of look on them to be as well. And I also think the other point is that the need for looking across disciplines at this is clear because it crosses institutions, etc. too. And so a spirit of optimism combined with a spirit of interdisciplinary collaboration, if I can put those two things together, I think that'll come to this debate and to this decade in particular. And if we've contributed in a small part to that with our empirical work, then I shall be delighted. And certainly this conversation has left me 4 percentage points more hopeful than going in, which is a lot.
All right. That's a very successful intervention.
It's statistically significant.
It is, given the starting point. It is.
Right.
All right. Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much to all of you for joining us and to our audience for tuning in, and take care.